Thank you for being here early, bright. And despite the heat yesterday, we might have lost half of the population to heat struck. So yeah, thank you for keeping up with the ambitious and very full and very great program because of you. And I would like to give the floor to our first panel. And thank you for also your patience for waiting.
Good morning and welcome to the first panel of the day, which is Politics of Belonging, Voices and Silencing. I would like to say a few words about the general topic of the panel, just to set the scene for the presentations and for our discussion. So, it's belonging. We know that we see a growing tension around who belongs and who is excluded from national communities. The question of belonging in recent years especially have become charged with the rise of populist politics, which often define the people in narrow exclusionary terms. Populist rhetoric tends to draw sharp lines between insiders and outsiders, between those seen as the true members of a nation and those labeled as threats. Today's panel explores how the politics of belonging and populism intersect to reshape identities, redraw boundaries, and redefine who deserves to participate fully in society. And literature on belonging roughly focuses on two main questions: to whom to belong and where to belong. And to whom to belong relates to group belonging, and to where to belong implies place belongingness. I think both questions apply to populist politics. Inside the state borders, it's mainly to whom to belong. Outside of the borders, especially for immigrants and diaspora groups, it is to where to belong. Indeed, belonging is different than politics of belonging. While belonging is an emotion, a feeling of being at home, but politics of belonging refers to political projects constructing belonging in particular ways for particular collectivities. So also belonging is a temporal phenomenon in the sense that it changes and it diverges from one point to the other. In today's panel, with two fascinating articles, we'll delve into different facets of belonging, and we'll try to see in this regard how culture and politics shape the feeling of belonging, and we'll do this in a historical context, which well reflects the interdisciplinary character of our conference. So this is what I would like to say about politics of belonging and populism in a nutshell. Now I'll give the floor to our presenters. So our first presenter is Maria Merivo-Parro. She's a Marie Curie Fellow at University of Jyväskylä, and the title of her article is The Sense of Belonging, Olfactory Narratives and the Dynamics of Democratization. Maria, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here indeed. I'm going to tell you a nice story, actually. First, I'm going to tell you a bit of political history, then I'm going to tell you a bit about olfactory cultural studies, and then I'm going to try and put those two together and see if that makes sense. But first, let me set the scene. Late 1980s, Soviet-occupied Estonia. Very difficult economic situation. As you probably know, the end of the Soviet era was Well, the economy was really not performing for anybody at that time. There were overwhelming shortages. There was deficit of pretty much everything. So whenever there was anything in stores, people would just flock and stand in these queues for hours on end, waiting for their chance to buy whatever happened to be in the store that day. This reality could not be hidden from the Finns, the Finnish people who were not part of the Soviet empire. They were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, but they were one of the few people from the other side of the Iron Curtain who had regularly visited Estonia since 1965, when the ferry connection between the two capitals, this very short sea ride, was again created. So they were able to see the crumbling of this system firsthand, and the dire situation touched them. And a lot of Finns who saw this felt like something needed to be done because this place is on the verge of a humanitarian disaster. But as you know, there was a thing called Finlandization, which is a term that was now used for different contexts, but it was born out of the reality that Finland itself, even though it was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, was always sort of trying to be friendly with the Soviet Union. And to the point where it also coordinated its foreign policy with the Soviet Union, some of its interior politics. And it's this notion that a bigger state has a lot of influence on the smaller one for political reasons. The reason for Finlandization, of course, is the history, the very violent attack that the Soviet Union launched during the Second World War on Finland, the Winter War, the continuation war later on. Finland also had the Lapland War. So there was this very bloody history there, as well as a 1,300-kilometer land border, most of it in sparsely inhabited Arctic territory. So they had a reason to be scared because this ambition never went away. It still hasn't gone away, as we know. So anyway, that's the reason why Finland was always sort of with one hand stroking this big giant to their east, but with the other hand, they were actually preparing for war. Every apartment building in Finland has a bomb shelter. They have more fighter jets than the UK. They are very heavily invested in this and have been throughout the Cold War. But again, officially, they didn't really want to say or do anything that might upset the Soviet Union. So the government was helping Estonia in its own way behind the scenes, but not doing it publicly, which meant that a lot of Finns felt outrage. There were even protests against the government because of the fact that, why aren't you helping these people? So that brought about the feeling in a lot of citizens that, well, if the government's not doing much, maybe, we should take it upon ourselves to do something to help. And indeed, the result was this very cordial, I think, Finnish-Estonian connection, this grassroots international relations where strangers became friends with the sole purpose of helping each other. It was kind of a diplomacy of the people, and this aid was indeed spontaneous. It was, you can see people from Kouvola, this women's club, Martta Kerho. They are delivering food and clothes, and this white box is a sewing machine, anything that they felt might empower their former strangers, new friends in Estonia. This is them actually delivering this on their own. So this was very spontaneous. It wasn't organized by any big organization. Yes, there were smaller ones in different villages, different locations, but by and large, it was improvisation. And it brought about these personal relationships between the people and empowerment on both sides. Because again, if you can imagine not having basic necessities and then having an abundance of these, it was very empowering for the Estonians, but also for the Finns. I mean, these were not wealthy people. These were regular people who just had a little bit extra. You could buy a pack of flour or a pack of raisins or send some pantyhose or medicine or something. The little that they did had a huge impact, and they were able to see this because, again, they were able to visit. And this was not unnoticed by the foreign press as well, because, yeah, this was a big phenomenon at the time. And this is an example from The Economist, for example. In 1989, they write, Pick up the heavy Sunday edition of Helsingin Sanomat, the leading Helsinki newspaper, and it is so full of stories about Estonia that it might as well be Estonian. Finnish enthusiasm for the Estonian cause is expressed in a practical desire to help, say some Finns, with a sense of guilt about how little was done before. The button's not working anymore. No. No. Oh, thank you so much. So that was the short version of the political history. Now a short version of olfactory cultural studies. Smell. What is smell? Well, it's actually just tiny bits of whatever it is that we're smelling, floating through the air, and they bump into us all the time. They're on our skin, they're in our hair, they're in our eyeballs. We don't feel them. But if they make their way up our nose, that's a whole different ballgame because there's this lock and key mechanism, and this teeny tiny piece of a thing unlocks the receptor, and then a signal is transferred to the brain. Not the particle itself, but just information about the particle. And in the brain, we have this wonderful, intricate identification process whereby the brain sort of quantifies this information and thinks, okay, instead of one molecule, what if there would be like 3 billion molecules of this? What would that mean? And sometimes the answer is that there's a chocolate cake nearby. And sometimes the answer is that there's a huge pile of stinky manure nearby. And then, we can make decisions based on this information. A lot of the meanings that we attach to smells come from our evolutionary past. For example, this very smelly pile of manure would probably seem disgusting to most people because now we know, with the help of our scientist friends, that, manure can be quite dangerous for the human organism, and it's best to stay away from that. So some of it comes from evolutionary past, but a lot of it is personal experience. Especially with newer things like chocolate cakes, which haven't been around for millions of years. And we have personal associations. For example, my classmate, she had to escape her burning house and they lost everything and she hates the smell of anything burning. But my mom remembers beautiful spring days when they were doing spring cleaning with the whole village, and there were these small piles of fires with dead leaves from the last year, and she loves the smell of anything burning because it brings back these beautiful memories. And smell is actually an integral part of also our eating experience because we have an infinite amount of smells that we can identify, but there are actually only 5 flavors. There's sweet, sour, salty, umami, and bitter. And all the beautiful complex flavors of your favorite foods and your snacks, those are actually just smell. And you can test this when next time you have your favorite snack or food or whatever you love, eat a little bit of it with all your senses, enjoy it, and then pinch your nose. And I bet all you're left with is either sweet, sour, salty, umami, or bitter, or a combination of these. Because indeed, everything else is to do with the nose. And again, our brain is very hardwired to, probably from our evolutionary past again, to attach meaning to smells. So brains actually store smell and emotion as one unit. You can't just store a smell. You have to have some sort of feeling associated with it. And that's the basis for marketing for a lot of consumer products, etc. So what I'm trying to do is sort of do the sensory mining via oral history and see what this great rupture in everyday experiences of going from this black and white scarcity to this overabundance of Western consumer products, like what did that actually look like in the soul of these people going through this change? And I'm using this 3-tier approach, which I can get into more later. If you're interested, looking for information donations. I'm not coercing people into these narratives, but they sort of find their way into the topic of food and smell quite naturally within the context of this topic. I'm looking for value judgments. I'm looking for morally sensitive words to tell the story of of smell. And I also have wonderful resources from correspondence of the time, especially between children. It was very common to set up these connections, again, between complete strangers. So an instance, what Finns would do is there would be a class in Finland whose teacher thought it would be good to, help or become friends with an Estonian school. They would just buy pencil cases with pencils, and everyone would put their address in one of them, and the whole box would be sent to Estonia, and then a class in a school would get it, and then they would find the addresses and start writing, and then they would get letters back, and this sort of grew sometimes into whole families becoming friends, visiting each other, and all of the food, clothes, toys, technology, medicine flowing with that exchange. And here's an example of one of the children's letters that's, again, spontaneously about food. This is a Finnish girl, Paula, writing to her Estonian pen friend, Rasmus. So what she's writing him is that she has been starting to learn Estonian, the language, and these are the sentences that she can now write to him. And she says, do you like ice cream? Ice cream tastes good. There's ice cream on the table. Take the ice cream from the table. A very ordinary everyday occurrence in her life, but for Rasmus, for him, there was no ice cream on the table. There was no ice cream in the store. He could not take it from the table. So like these two spheres or these two ways of existence meet very intimately because of the intimate nature of these relationships. And I think that this is perhaps something that we can use to, it's probably not the only cause, but it can have, I think, should have some sort of acknowledged role in this, I guess, the roots of Estonian exceptionalism when compared to other post-Soviet states, because any socioeconomic research done always puts us somewhere up there, and then most of the Soviet states are way, way, way down somewhere behind us. So yes, we have very high economic freedom, the 7th country in the world, low corruption, 12th in the world, good education, PISA #1 in Europe. We definitely are a digital leader in many fields. We are now also many years accepting refugees. Excuse me. We are a role model in NATO. There's this, the 2% input that is required, which bigger countries sometimes can't handle. I believe right now we're giving 5%, so we're always punching above our weight in those areas. We do have a voice. It is heard in global politics. And although Estonians like to think it's because we work really hard, I actually believe that this is part of the effects of this exchange, because, in a way, about Pavlovian conditioning, right? This researcher and the dogs and the treats and this, training the dogs to expect the treat. And although I recently read something that's also true, that we're all Pavlovianly conditioned, because whenever someone says Pavlovian conditioning, everyone thinks of a dog. But anyway, I think this is kind of what accidentally happened with this tailor-made relief, because, it's, again, it wasn't abstract. It wasn't things going somewhere. It was a Finnish lady asking an Estonian lady, why don't you just draw your child's footprint on the paper and send it to me in an envelope? I'll get you those winter boots. Don't worry. So it was specific things for specific people, things they needed most, the things that helped them most. And again, this very low risk of corruption, because if you have a country that's over here and a country that's over here, and they're sending huge, vast amounts of things, somebody's going to need to be the middleman. And if you're in this situation, you might get this human desire to maybe put something aside for your family or your friends. It's a precarious situation. Who knows what will happen? But in this case, it wasn't this state-to-state thing. It was person-to-person. It was from Tuovi in Finland to Saimaa in Estonia. There were no middlemen, so low risk of corruption. And these Maslow needs were met. You're not hungry anymore. You don't have to stand in line. You have your little stockpile at home. You have your new denim jacket from your Finnish friends. You go to that protest now against the Soviet occupation. Maybe you type your manifesto in the typewriter that they sent. So it also incited this, the fact that we were spoon-fed these wonderful things for years before the end of the Soviet Empire. It enabled people to really, think about bigger issues like, why do we have such different lives? If we're culturally so similar, we're geographically similar, they're our neighbor, we have a similar language. How come their lives are so different than ours? What is the reason for this? And again, getting this physical experience of freedom, like this taste of freedom, things that worked. A great example is like chewing gum. It's trivial, but the Soviet Union did have chewing gum. You put it in your mouth, it sort of disintegrated after 10 seconds, the taste was gone and it broke up into pieces. But from Finland, if you got a piece of chewing gum from Finland, you chewed it, tasted good. In the evening, you put it on your nightstand. In the morning, you wake up, you take it, it still works, just like democracy. It just works. Things from this place work and they smell good. And this is also another aspect of bodily odors. For example, when Finns were visiting Estonia, they had probably taken a shower that morning with their shower gel, used deodorant, used laundry detergent on their clean clothes. None of these were available in Soviet Estonia at the time. So I'm not saying Estonians were smelly, but hygiene was more of a practical affair, a brown bar of soap and some cold water, not all these fancy things. So when Finns arrived, they indeed seemed like these great smelling unicorns that had all the beautiful things in the world. So this smell of democracy, again, hand feeding us this information and desire and bits and pieces of this life for years before the end of the Iron Curtain. So that means we were sort of able to hit the ground running when 1991 arrived and Estonia became an independent country. There was some sort of consolidation already in place. People knew what they wanted. They wanted this taste of freedom, the smell of democracy. They wanted what Finland had. Whereas for a lot of other Soviet states who didn't have a neighbor like Finland, again, hand feeding them these wonderful things in the worst time in their life, they weren't so sure as to which way they should run, what they should do exactly. There was more confusion. And indeed, a lot of corruption, oligarchies emerged, still are quite prominent in many parts of the former Soviet Union. Whereas I believe this sort of Pavlovian conditioning, this olfactory experience of democracy and freedom, I believe it was sort of like a vaccination against oligarchy, specifically because there was not such a need for any type of, I guess, populist rhetoric to convince people of the perks of democracy, because they were already wearing it and eating it and smelling it for the past 5 years. So yeah, in short, that's my point. Thank you for listening.
Very much, Mariam. Now I'll give the floor to Maria Jacek. It's Silent Symbols, Loud Legacies, the Child in Populist Narratives of Post-Communist Poland.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and a privilege to contribute to this discussion. My name is Maria Jacek and I'm from Masaryk University, but I come from Poland. And today I invite you to think with me about a curious political figure and discourse that is often overlooked, but surprisingly powerful, the child. When we think about populist rhetoric, we used to focus on its most famous targets, the main ones, elites, migrants, or LGBTQ plus community. The child, less visible, less frequently analyzed, carries profound symbolic meaning, often unspoken, yet deeply influential. In Poland, especially under the United Right governance, children emerged not only as objects of policy, but as emotionally charged icons of morality and national destiny. But here's the paradox. If children follow the script, obedient, patriotic, Catholic, they are praised as future of Poland. And if they don't, if they deviate by being critical, queer, politically active, or simply non-conforming, they are framed as ideological threats. My research looks at how this dualism works in populist narratives and how it brings back older patterns, especially from the communist times, when the child was also shaped to serve the state. This research asks two key questions. First, why do populist narratives, the exclusionary ones about children, still resonate in Poland? And second one is, how do today's populist narratives reuse and reshape the communist era visions of the child? These questions uncover how memory, politics, and identity converge in the symbolic figure of the child. To ground this research, I draw on three intersecting fields: populism studies, childhood studies, and sociology of memory. Populist discourse thrives on moral binaries and between the people and their enemies, between purity and corruption. The child, as an implicit signifier, becomes a mirror reflecting either national purity or a threat to it. The perspective of childhood studies reminds us that children are citizens, not citizens in the making. They are frequently spoken about, but rarely spoken with. They are reduced to symbols rather than recognized as participants in public life. Although communism collapsed over 30 years ago, its impact still shapes policies and mindsets. Post-Soviet trauma is a form of collective suffering rooted in communist and Soviet past. We can see it in public debates, policy making, and how societies raise the next generation. And in many post-communist countries, political leaders often draw on this trauma to claim moral authority currently. To investigate these questions, I analyzed political speeches by law and justice officials and archival propaganda films from the communist era. This allowed me to trace how narratives about children and childhood have been reused, reshaped, and recharged across two very different political systems. And on the picture, there is a school building in late 60s, when children during their summer break were building the school. And I think building school is a very significant metaphor here, when also during populist times, the school is a very important institution which is serving as ideological tool. So let's begin with how Law and Justice Party constructs the child in its political storytelling. Here, the child becomes more than a person. They're a symbol of nation's moral health. The ideal child, patriotic, obedient, Catholic, heterosexual, upholds Polish traditions and embodies family's values that populist parties seek to protect. But this protection is not extended to every child. Children who are politically active, progressive in their views, or simply critical are portrayed as corrupted or dangerous. And they don't fit in the image of a so-called our children. Now, if we compare it to the communist era narratives, we see a similar logic. The ideal child back then was loyal to socialism, disciplined, and collective-minded. The deviant child, on the other hand, was capitalistic and individualistic, and also seen as a threat. So while the ideology has shifted from socialism to nationalism, the need to define, protect, and purified childhood remains central in both eras. And here I would like my words not to seem so abstract, and I put few quotations that can be simply shown what I'm doing. They're translated with AI, so hopefully they can give the sense how it sounds in Polish. So it's most of them is about the neoliberal type and sexualizations, which plays a vital role. And also the last one, it simply shows how the borders are drawn between our children and other children. So let's move on to how the law and justice discourse and how it presents children as constantly under the ideological attack. And it's especially from liberal values and cultural outsiders. And this framing fuels moral panic, a sense that Polish children must be defended at all costs. But this technique, again, isn't new. During communist period, children were also seen as vulnerable to foreign dangers, especially from the capitalist West. But Law and Justice updates this with other enemies, like cultural one. For example, LGBTQ+ activists. It's not longer about economics, it's about the values and the identity. So in both cases, the goal is similar. Use fear to justify tighter control over what children learn, how they are raised, and who has access to them. And here a bit more of the quotes, as the children play a vital role and they are in the centrality of what state should do and how it should take care. It's also the last quote can see also how other binaries are constructed and merged, that it's also about being against European. So here it's also hands off of our kids. So it's again the more and more differentiation is overlapping. Finally, in both eras, children become a symbol, not speakers. They appear in every political conversation, but rarely as agents with opinions or views. In Law and Justice vision, the child represents national purity and future stability. But the image also silences the children who don't fit in. Under communism, we again saw similar tactics. Children were presented in films as the ones who were always cheerful, disciplined, and loyal to the state. They sang for party leaders, built schools, and followed the rules. But they never questioned. They never protested. Their image was carefully controlled. Today, Law and Justice does the same thing through media, through curriculum and policy, casting children as moral symbols, not partners in shaping the society. So in both populist and communist frameworks, the child reflects back the values the state wants to enforce. And here is a picture from one of the propaganda films where the Communist Party leader, Bierut, is entering the school for the Children's Day. Children are standing straight and saluting for him. So this is the picture, how the children are loyal and showing the respect to the party leaders. So here I would like also to show you that the children are used as the political tool, both back in time during communist times where politicians used to create propaganda by showing and photographing themselves with children. And it's back again, especially during the populist governance. And at the very end, I would like to say a few words why it is important to investigate the children from my perspective. So first of all, I would like to say that children is a figure where the exclusions can overlap. It can be several exclusions on the figure of child. It can be migration background, racial one, sexual one, but what is important that the children, at least in Poland, they do not have human rights advocate because it's chosen from the parliament. And another thing, according to the Soviet era, and is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine led us to rethink and uncover the impact of Soviet, which has on also both Soviet states and the communist ones. And I also would like to say that the narratives are shaping the reality. So when we see at the map, we can see that Eastern and Central European countries, they rarely has child policy and the other structure about the child participation and laws. And I want you to treat my presentation as an invitation to think how children become a political tools and how they are used in your national context. So I know in Poland we have saying that children and fish do not have a voice, which goes hand in hand with English. Children should be seen, not heard. So therefore, it's an invitation for you. And to the very end, I would like to say that populism claims to break with the past, yet it inherits the most powerful symbol from it. The child remains silent, but the ideological childhood still echoes loudly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. Before opening the floor for questions, I have two boring questions for you, and then we'll start our discussions with our audience. While reading your paper, Maria, I just wanted to see more about your methodology. I know it's an ethnographic research, more or less. Yeah, just could you please tell us a bit more? How did you conduct your research for this paper? And also, I wanted to see to understand how you come to the conclusion that this relates to the dynamics of democratization. Did you look into the resistance literature, or how did you come up with your conclusions, especially with regard to the democratization process in Estonia?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, methodologically, it's as I've mentioned to some people before, it's actually very qualitative. It's mostly an oral history project. This stemmed from the fact that I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and I was looking for someone years ago to just make a comment to one of my TV shows about this phenomenon, which I said was everybody knows about this. You ask an Estonian, they will have a friend in Finland. But because it's so well known, such a basic narrative, and there's no surprise in this story, and it's quite recent. Nobody had actually researched this, so I couldn't find a historian who would say like, okay, I'm the expert, I can tell you what happened. So that sort of made me think that, okay, if no one's researching this, and it's been 30 years, and these people, as I mentioned, are quite elderly, somebody has to at least get to their motivations, at least ask them why they did this and how it was for them to get this firsthand information, because I mean, if you're a researcher of antiquity and you could interview Julius Caesar, but you just choose not to and just decide on other, you know, sources on what he thinks, what he thought and what he felt and why he did the things he did, that just doesn't make sense. So again, I was thinking, well, this huge event happened. I just have to capture these stories. So that's what I've been basically doing. Speaking with people in Estonia, different generations were involved with this, and Finland, of course. And I'm also planning to do more of a quantitative segment to complement this, just to get us to what were the abstract numbers as to how many people were perhaps actually involved. So that's still something that I plan to do in fall semester. But as for and of course, in addition to this, creating this new archive, new oral history collection, I do the basic historical things. So archives in Finland, Estonia. I've gone through, community archives, school archives, president's archives, all sorts of different things. A lot of course, media studies, newspapers at the time, TV shows of the time, radio programs of the time. There are still some things left. So it's like this more of a juxtaposition of these different voices. But again, my main contribution is just making these stories exist in other forms than memory. But as for the dynamics of democratization, yes. Well, I forgot to mention one of my first research topics that I dealt with as a historian was actually this transition. So I spent years working on this specific thing and looking at how it exactly happened in Estonia. How did the singing revolution came about? These different parties. There's so many interesting phenomena there as well. Also this global diaspora, the consolidation with them, the fact that Estonia was one of the few countries who didn't create a new republic, but they reinstated the old republic, the one that they had made after World War I, which legally is a whole different ballgame again. And yeah, and the fact that the legality of the occupation, which was kept on the political agenda by the very politically active diaspora globally, not just Estonian, but Lithuanian and Latvian. There was this great collaboration between these three peoples all over the world. And even though we're small countries and the diasporas were even smaller, the fact that this activity was so well coordinated, it sort of amplified the message. So indeed, most countries never recognized Estonia as belonging to the Soviet Union or Latvia or Lithuania. So that was always this doctrine of non-recognition of this annexation. So yeah, and that all sort of came to this, 5-year process, basically, when Gorbachev, in a crisis, decided to have the people, with glasnost and perestroika, you can have your thoughts, you can air your thoughts. And it's one of our politicians famously said that it's like democracy is like toothpaste. It's very easy to get it out of the tube, but you can't put it back in. And that's kind of what happened. And in the Estonian case, again, which is special, is it was completely nonviolent. Not a single drop of blood was shed. The whole process took place in this very intricate borderline of tradition and change, and sort of constantly working within Gorbachev's reforms to sort of, come up to the conclusion which later actually happened. So I have done a lot of this research before, but I just didn't include it because of time purposes. But it's sort of in the backdrop of where I'm coming from, making these grand conclusions or allusions.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. And for you, Maria, my question is how we can define the populist construction of the childhood. I was thinking maybe it's just conservative traditional perception of childhood. What makes it populist? Also, if we can apply othering, exclusion to this in this context, because this is not something like anti-migrant or anti-LGBT discourse in populist politics, because in that we see a clear exclusion and othering process. But when it comes to children, it's different, I think, because they do not directly exclude some children, but via education, they try to win those children. So how do you locate your research in populist politics in this regard?
Okay, so well, in this regard, I think the most important here is drawing the lines and building up on these exclusions. I presented few quotations that are marking these lines, and I do think that it's merging, it's the narratives is building and shaping the reality. So these other children are not our children, and I think that it's like the political speeches or the reference is the pillar, the foundation on what is happening next by education. And yeah, we had a few issues, with, for example, with the curriculum changes and adding new subjects in Poland, that the history is the purifying the Polish history and that we were all the time on the good side. And also it's removing the people who were different back in the past from the history. So it's shaping the one possible way of children. And yeah, also the child is becoming the empty signifier. So there is much put how this child should be and how it should work. And the other remark here is that it's leading to silencing the others and dehumanizing them, basically, because that's what populists do. And by children is the figure where the exclusions are overlapping. So I would not say that here it's just conservative, but it's strengthened with this powerful narratives and shaping the vision of nation. So it's more far than the conservative thought, I think, in my opinion. And it's combined with the policy changes as well, and removing the bodies, for example, in the Ministry of Education, where the children were advising the minister, but now they are removed. So their voice is also taken away.
Thank you. Just my one humble suggestion would be you can relate your research more with child studies, especially when it comes to some concepts, for example, independence versus obedience, because we can't see this those concepts as we apply to adults. So maybe you can make your argument more stronger with how we define those concepts when it comes to children, and of course with some education literature as well. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, now floor is open for questions. Yes, please.
Sorry, I missed your presentation because of a brain issue, but I read parts of your paper and I found it very interesting. The part about Western packaging as a status symbol, if I understood correctly, you showed how it helped bring people together. But in a populist setting where leaders often divide the people, as you've seen in the us versus them, could this kind of symbolic consumption also work differently? Lead to other results, less desirable results, I think?
Bless you. I'm not sure in this context that it did. I mean, well, I kind of allude to this cargo cult in the living room where sometimes, people were so enamored with a pineapple preserve that they, after eating it, they put the tin box into their living room on display on this altar of consumerism, and maybe like those kinds of things. There was this, you know, perhaps with to do with your topic as well. There was this youth culture at the time of collecting all sorts of cans that tourists left behind, and sort of also like beer and all these fancy alcohol bottles, and it's sort of, some kids would do anything to get their hands on a specific can, and some people would take advantage of that perhaps. And so perhaps there was this, sometimes the desire and the aspirations that were very much fed, you know, through mass media, because again, unlike other Soviet republics, Estonia was in this Finnish media sphere from the 70s because of the very powerful signals that the Finnish TV and radio were emitting. So yeah, we were very much in tune with what happened on Dallas or Dynasty or who was Michael Knight, and we knew all that. But we also had this desire for, you know, life that we didn't have. So in that sense, perhaps, especially right before this exchange happened, you know, there might have been some mental health effects that were not positive with constantly seeing, because if you see Dallas or Dynasty or anything else, you would assume that's how Americans live. You know, you don't necessarily think it's just the oil millionaires. You just think it's, yeah. But with this very human contact with the Finns, I think it was sort of directed in a more healthy direction. Although I have to say the 90s were cowboy capitalism all over the former Soviet Union. So I'm not saying it was a perfect non-rocky path to where we are now, but there was enough of this momentum, which again, I believe was sort of hand-fed into us to resist the temptation to go the oligarchy way. And I think a chewing gum that works has more power than you think, and the decisions that an individual makes or doesn't make, I think has a big impact, which I think is so comforting to find out for me right now in this day and age when we seem like the problems are so big and we can't do anything about them. But well, actually quite recently, little bit helped. So yeah. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, another question there.
Thank you very much. One question on the second paper on the child in populist narratives. I was wondering whether in these populist narratives they connect, so to say, the child and the people, because there is a kind of contrast or a kind of difficulty there. If you want to say, I mean, from the populist point of view. Would they say that in those examples, would they say that those children who have the wrong ideology, so to say, would they say that they do not belong to the people, or because on the one hand they do belong to the people from their point of view because they share some kind of same ethnicity or something like that, but they have the wrong ideas. So how do they kind of connect that? How do they find a way to say that children with the wrong ideology, who are from a certain point of view the future of the people, belong or do not belong to the people?
So, well, how it is said. It is said that these children are not the part of what it should be. And there is a huge blaming who made it like this. Especially there is blaming for the opposition leaders from the previous governance, of course, and how it is like, they're not belonging basically, as there's way more of the questions, quotations. Here are just the examples, but the summary of it is that the curriculum in the school should be tighter to make them the right people, because they are treated as they are not the Poles. So that's how it is showed. I don't know if I understood, like if I'm.
No, I mean I fully understand that, but So it means that they belong to the people, but they need some kind of new education to properly belong to the
Yeah,
people.
because they are not treated as the poles, the right poles,
Yeah,
the
okay.
soul. So that maybe it's not straight as it is towards adults, this construction lines,
Yeah, yeah.
because it's a bit softer. I mean, softer as you could see before on the quotations. There are like children who are rainbowish, and there are normal children.
Yeah.
So
Because I mean, on the one hand, if populists say that they have a kind of ethnical understanding of the people, then they should just say that they are part of the people and that's all.
but here is like some incoherency.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's what I'm also trying, this grasp on all this nuances. But it's not so obvious because some of the speeches are contradicting.
We can perhaps continue, but rather than a question, I think I'll ask I'll ask for both presenters to kind of open up the discussion a little bit more on some regards. And regarding the first presentation, I think it was fascinating to see a study on sensory ethnography of this particular movement in history. And it kind of does a good way of archaeology of relationships between these two nations. And in that way, kind of gives as an idea of how peoplehood emerges and a new peoplehood emerges. So I thought that idea was very interesting. But again, going to the archaeology of relationships approach, the examples kind of suggest, and the thing that you said about, one mother asking for another mother to draw their shoe, that seems like some sort of a relationship of care, mutual care and interest. But I wasn't really sure about if that is what you see as a pattern, or did the correspondences that you study were in line with a more hierarchical vision of one side helping the other one, guiding it to this to a new culture of consumerism. So is it a combination of the two, or how do these two dimensions interact, was what I was wondering. And for the second presentation, again, like a very interesting presentation. And it reminded me of this scholarship on how the notions of ideal woman change in between transitions, and usually the literature on that points towards differences between, the populist order or the communist order. But what I saw in your presentation is like a continuity when it comes to the children. What do you think about that? Or can you, is it something relevant for your analysis? Do you think, or like the comparison between, the ideal woman, because like women and children are also another kind of a side category over there. So is there differences, similarities? What would it tell us about our future studies of perhaps diverting more interest into the child, especially from a feminist point of view? What do you think?
So thank you for your question, and also thank you for the one before, because I'm not sure if I said thanks for that. But yeah, we can say, as you see, that there is some continuity, same but different. And well, yeah, it's also the point of reference that change between what was communist and what is now. And so far, a lot of been studied also from the families and the populist narratives. That's why it's also some point of entry, as the woman was also analyzed deeply in the populist vision, how it intersects with religion. In Polish case, it was also very strictly connected to the abortion ban, and how the feminism and the Catholic and populist vision of woman emerged, and how it is more modern woman, but still the populist one. So it's also some, the child is something new in this context and analyzing the narratives and populist attitudes, because it's much said, but not. So how do I see the future of it and what I'm studying? For me, the point of entry actually was the child participation, and so seeing the lack of child policies. Also from the urban perspective, you can see that there is UNICEF child-friendly cities, and it's way much more of them in the western side than in east. In Poland, we have basically one, or now one is candidate city to become a child-friendly. So that's my, let's say, wider point of entry. And yeah, I think it's like, what do I see about the future of this research? It's very interesting for me to compare it with other countries, especially Hungary, because like there we were compared with Poland and Hungary were like two similar and similar, not similar, but cases where the populists were ruling for a while. In Poland, they stopped, but yeah, in Hungary, Orban is still in power. So I think that's interesting, and to also position the different, the different historic backgrounds, because I think that's what I want to do in the future, and that's what I want to focus on. And I think I will say, because what connects both of us, I think, is that we have there is some communist common sense in the countries, which is maybe hard to, it was taken for granted for a while, but it's not so easy to grasp. And yeah, I see myself as the first generation of independent Poland from 1795, and the perspective has shifted, and that allows to uncover more.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, indeed. The sociology of gift giving is so fascinating. It's always about sort of, you know, if you have a debt of gratitude, you give something to be equal again, but you always want to give like a little more just to show your appreciation. And then the other person feels a debt, and then they want to give a gift that's just a little bit more. And this sort of like accumulates and it grows and it grows. And this indeed happened with my informants as well. And sometimes it wasn't just material gifts, it was immaterial or like these intangible gifts. For example, there's this very funny case, which I really try to always, if I interview someone and on one side, I try to find their pen pal on the other side, or if there's two schools that have relationships, we try to go to both. And one country school in Estonia, one country school in Finland, they had been sending things and then they were coming for a visit. So the Estonian kids, you know, their teachers drilled them. We have this tradition of song festival and dance festival, you know, tens of thousands kids doing this exactly the same way. And, you know, those kids were trained and they worked really hard to give the perfect performance for their friends who were coming. And because, you know, the reasoning was like, they've helped us so much, we cannot pay in kind. So we have to like do something to show them our appreciation, which is nice. But then I hear from the Finnish side later on, I go to interview them, and then this lady says, yes, and then we went, and then they all, you know, ran, the children had picked flowers and they gave us flowers, and then they gave such performance, and we thought, what are we going to do when they come to visit us? We don't have these kinds of choirs or these like folk ensembles. How are we going to repay this cultural experience? So it's funny how those things sort of grow. But in terms of women, and I think the whole process was quite gendered also. It's interesting to see because in the first, well, there's research about this, not my research, but sociological research at the time, that Estonian women versus Finnish women, they had about 2 to 3 hours more domestic labor every day, simply because there were no appliances. There was, you know, if you had a baby, you had to sew the diapers, you had to boil them every day and clean them, and then you had to grow your own carrots and make some sort of thing for your child to eat, you know, and all of this combined with the Soviet women, of course, had to also be very active in the workforce and in society. So there was this triple pressure on women, very hard life for a lot of, you know, women in that generation, and this sort of sisterhood with the Finnish Finnish women really helped. So it was these women mostly who were doing this at first, but then when these economic relations became more active and in the end of the Soviet era, but also in the 90s, because Finland is huge, you know, it's big, it's bigger than the UK, and they only have 5 million people, and they need workforce, and Estonians were, you know, dying to get a decent salary for anything. So this work migration, labor migration happened very actively, changed the whole diaspora logic. Up until that point, it had always been Russia who had the biggest Estonian diaspora community because of deportations, colonization, always Russia. Even during the Cold War with these active refugee diasporas, still it was Russia. But then magically, in the beginning of this century, it switches. And now it's Finland because, again, these networks were in place, the language competence was in place. So a lot of families sort of ended up being on both shores at the same time. And now, you know, there's this talk for a long while about connecting the capitals, kind of like the tunnel that England and France have, but between two capitals, Tallinn in Estonia, Helsinki in Finland, creating this new double city called Helsinki. The train ride would be like 10, 15 minutes under the sea. Or Hellin, if you put it in another way, it's more ominous. But actually, it's the Finns who are more interested in this project because for them, and I've only realized this now that I've been living there for a year, they sort of feel like they're on an island because if you think of their geography, they can't, if they want to go anywhere, they have to take a plane or a boat or a 20-hour Arctic road trip to Sweden or Norway or somewhere. So they feel like they're on an island, but this would sort of connect them with continental Europe as well. So I see a lot of interest on their side to like further this integration between the two countries.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentations and also with some background in this kind of post-communist narratives and rhetoric. I was still wondering about this connection between these interpersonal relationships and democratization, especially the vaccination against oligarchy, which I found a very interesting concept. But how this causality in a way can be proven, if this is what you would like to prove, because if I think about, I don't know empirically enough on the historical context, but I think in Central Europe there were also these kinds of interpersonal linkages, like between Austria, for instance, and Czechoslovakia, so that people had their contacts and they were bringing sometimes gifts to each other. So maybe on a smaller scale, but if this is something that is the unique factor, then maybe we would need to see whether it hasn't been happening also in Central Europe. And I wonder, because you mentioned Russia in your last response, whether this is actually maybe a more important differentiating factor, that the threat of Russia, of resurgence and control of the territory of the political community by Russia is greater, certainly in Estonia, than in Central Europe, where this has been forgotten very quickly, that there has been also a strong control of the Soviet Union, although in a more indirect way in that region. So to what extent maybe that external factor, that external threat of Russia may be more central explanatory note. And then just a very small note on the children. I heard a paper on political philosophy just recently at another conference, which has argued that actually it's the kind of disempowerment of children as political subjects, even in democracies, that then causes a lot of sources of injustice towards children. And so in that sense, it's not restricted to some regimes like Poland and Hungary, but in most countries, for instance, political rights of children below 18 are mostly non-existent. So I wonder whether this is something that also speaks to the framework that you have, whether you account for this in your framework.
Thanks for the questions. Yeah, definitely. There have been instances of help before. But with the Central European case, you know, Czechoslovakia was never in the Soviet Union, neither was Poland. So they were, for Estonians as well, seen as, you know, abroad. So they had it easy. It was the Estonian perspective. So whenever anyone went to Prague or you know, that's the place where you get those winter boots that you don't get from your own country. So those are like very far removed from the Soviet reality, really, if you look at that. But yeah, you're right. This I have noticed this as well, just from casual conversations as well with my friends in Central Europe. You know, there's this notion of probably somewhat populist notion of the Slavic Brotherhood, and it's viewed very differently if this the occupation has not in fact happened on their land as it has in others. But in terms of Finland and Estonia, like I mentioned, Finland, Estonia only has 130 kilometers of border. It's a very small border, whereas Finland has 1,300 in this very sparsely populated area. But because of Finlandization, I guess you could formally say that Finlandization sort of ended last year when Finland finally dared to join NATO. So in that sense, like this process it's still too interesting to live through. Probably also will provide a lot of food for thought and work for future historians. But as to how and if I can, you know, pinpoint this as this like a cause, or like is a causality or correlation? Luckily, because I'm not a sociologist and I'm only focused on oral history, so the rule of thumb there is, you know, it's kind of a belief-based system. We're interested in what people think about things that they did in their life. So in that sense, their stories sort of validate themselves in a way. And of course, you know, it's this famous quote, I think it's by Alessandro Portelli, who said that informants never lie to a good oral historian. They just end up revealing the truth in some new, unexpected ways.
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting one. And I do also know, I think I know actually the paper you're talking about. But yeah, like what is the point here? What's important to notice and acknowledge that there is also decrease in the children born rates. So there is less children simply. So that's why I think it's also important to talk about this. But the second question is, what if child policies and other children-related laws did not emerge, especially in the third wave of democracies? So if we are seeing the decrease and the devaluation of role as in the children as citizens, what if they did not emerge after communism, the child policies and so on? But what is important in the populism, that the narratives are strengthening at this devaluation and the role of the children in the nation states. Thank you.
Yes, Sumaya?
I have been thinking about consumption. So when people consume bitter things, what makes it different from the regular capitalist consumption versus the democratization of equal access to the resources? And how would you understand and define the difference? Yeah, this.
Could you just I think I'm not hearing you very well. Can you just repeat? It's the echo.
No, sorry. So when you talk about the like the people having access to better resources, having like the luxurious, maybe not luxurious, but basic things with smells. So in early 20th century, when people had access to a lot of resources, this is how we understand partially democratization process too. So, but there's a relationship between capitalism and democracy. And there's a relationship between equal access and democracy. So in what sense do you approach democratization in your work with people having more choices in their lives? Maybe how do you distinguish it from capitalism or?
Thank you so much. Well, in my research, I don't actually get to the capitalist part, so it sort of ends with regaining of independence. But it's a very valid question, and especially now, I mean, even the people who are telling me their stories, they sort of, they self-censor themselves sometimes, or they tell the story and then they have this moment of reflection where they're like, well, you know, they sort of recognize the fact that this bigger, better, more, you know, more colorful, more artificial, more mass-produced, that it's not in the social mores of what would be somebody dream about today. And they sort of recognize the fact that it was a different time, different era, and this desire overrode all sorts of ecological, you know, concerns that we would have today. So it's very interesting to take these interviews at this point of time when capitalism has undoubtedly arrived, along with its many, you know, highs and lows, and people are feeling it across Europe, across the world. And it's this, yeah, that could be like perhaps an interesting side project on the self-reflection that these people make who have gone through this kind of a magical era, if you think about it, because a lot of them from the Estonian side, they grew up, you know, with just dreams of maybe someday having like a Coca-Cola or a banana, and then actually getting these dreams fulfilled, and then living in what their younger self would describe as an overabundant utopia, and like going through this process. I mean, I'm sure they didn't think at the time that, oh, I'm so lucky to have been born in like 1980s scarcity Soviet Union and stand in line for all these hours with my mom. That wasn't probably the thought in their head, but now in retrospect, some people do have this notion of, I got to see magic. How many young Estonians growing, you know, up in this like capitalist society that have access to all these things, they don't even know what it feels like to have something magical happen in your life. Whereas for these people, for a lot of the younger ones with the pen pals, and they saw magic like rolling like happening right in front of their face and in their life, and they had this wonderful experience. But nowadays it's very different. There's less appreciation of the magic of a banana, for example, on your breakfast table. It's very everyday. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? It seems that we are all done. Despite we have only 2 presentations today, we could consume the time that allocated to this panel. Thank you so much for all your contributions, and thanks a lot to our fascinating presenters. And I think we'll have a coffee break now, and we'll